It's been a few days since I started writing this account, but I hadn't had the courage to post it here on the channel. After seeing many people sharing their supernatural experiences, I gathered the courage and decided to tell what happened to me. What I'm about to narrate is something disturbing, something that still makes me wonder if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. It all began when my 3 friends and I decided to rent an isolated cabin in the Nevada desert. The plan was to disconnect from the world, enjoy the peace of the place, and spend a few days away from the city hustle. The cabin was about 30 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by miles of desert and rocks. The landscape was beautiful during the day, but when night fell, the isolation became unsettling. We arrived at the location in the early afternoon, and the first impression was a good one. The cabin was rustic but charming, with simple furniture and a porch that overlooked the endless horizon of the desert. We spent the first few hours exploring the area around, taking photos and walking along sand trails. The silence was almost complete, interrupted only by the sound of wind cutting through the rocks. As the sun began to set, we decided to light the campfire outside the cabin and open some beers. The night was cold, and the starry sky seemed like something out of a dream. We talked, laughed, and even told some ghost stories, not imagining that in a few hours we would be living something worthy of these stories. Around 10 p.m., we heard the first strange sound. It sounded like something being dragged, as if something was being pulled through the sand, but we couldn't tell where it came from. One of my friends, Matt, joked that it was just the wind, but the expression on his face told me he was also suspicious. The sound stopped, and we tried to get back to our relaxed mood. Shortly after, while I was looking at the stars, I noticed something peculiar on the horizon. It was a faint light, flickering, like a lantern being swung at a distance. At first I thought it could be another group of people camping, but the light seemed to be moving erratically, unnaturally. I called the others to look, and we all became intrigued. "It must be a lost traveler," Sarah suggested, trying to appear unconcerned. We decided to ignore the light and continue by the campfire. But from that moment on, the atmosphere began to change. The silence that once felt comforting now seemed oppressive, and every sound around us seemed louder. A sense of being watched started to settle in. When the embers of the fire began to fade, we agreed to head inside the cabin. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, a main room, and a small kitchen. Matt and I stayed on the sofa bed in the main room while Sarah and Rachel shared one of the bedrooms. I locked all the doors and windows before we lay down, just as a precaution. The strong wind made the beams of the cabin creak, creating a haunting soundtrack for that night. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound that paralyzed me. It was like a light tapping on the outside wall of the cabin, repetitive and rhythmic, as if someone was tapping their fingertips. Matt also woke up and looked at me, whispering, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, unsure of what to do. We lay in silence, trying to listen more carefully. The sound stopped for a few seconds, only to be replaced by something even more terrifying. The sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was intentionally walking around the cabin. These were human steps, not animals. My heart raced. Matt signaled for us to stay quiet, and we grabbed our phones, but there was no network signal to call for help. The sound of the footsteps continued for several minutes until they moved to the back of the cabin where the girls' bedroom window was. It was then that Sarah screamed. We ran to the room, finding them huddled in the corner. Sarah pointed to the window, and when we looked, we saw the same light from earlier, now much closer, faintly illuminating a silhouette. A tall, thin figure standing motionless, staring inside. Panic set in. We locked the bedroom door while the figure remained there, unmoving. Rachel began to cry, while Matt tried to find something to defend us with. That's when we heard a new sound, this time from the front door. 3 loud, measured knocks, as if it were a warning. The figure had company. The sound of pounding on the door echoed through the cabin as if it came from inside our own heads. I could hear everyone's heavy breathing as we tried to process what was happening. No one dared to move or speak. The silence after the pounding was even more terrifying than the sound itself. Matt held a knife he'd found in the kitchen, but the look on his face made it clear he had no idea what to do. Summoning whatever courage I could, I crept to the window and tried to peer outside. But the darkness was so dense that I could make out nothing beyond the faint glow outlining a figure. Then, just as quickly as I'd spotted it, the figure vanished. It wasn't comforting. If it wasn't there, where had it gone? Suddenly another sound, the creaking of the porch boards. Matt rushed to the living room, grabbing one of the wooden kitchen chairs to brace the door further. The sound of footsteps continued, circling the cabin. With every second, it seemed more footsteps joined in, like we were being surrounded. "They're trying to mess with us," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "They want us to open the door." "That's not happening," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I picked up my phone again, hoping the signal had returned, but the screen still read, "No service." Then we heard something different. It wasn't footsteps or pounding. It was a low, dragging sound coming from the side of the cabin, like something scraping against the wood. The sound moved slowly along the outer wall, testing our nerves. Rachel, curled up in the corner, began to sob quietly. Matt gripped the knife tighter. Suddenly, the porch light flickered, casting fleeting shadows that darted past the window. Sarah screamed, and Matt muttered something about how we couldn't stay here. "But how?" I asked, panic evident in my voice. "They're outside." That's when Rachel, near the side window, pointed out something that made my stomach twist. "The light," she whispered. "It's coming from the car." I looked outside, and sure enough, the light seemed to be coming from our car parked just outside. It was as if someone was using the headlights to blind us or to lure us out. Then came a loud crash from the car, followed by the sound of shattering glass. We bolted for the bedroom and locked ourselves inside again. "This is insane," Matt said, pacing. "We can't just sit here and wait." A heavy thud against the front door made the wood creak and splinter. The girls were panicked, and so was I. That's when Matt made a reckless decision. "I'll distract them," he said, gripping the knife. "You guys climb out the bedroom window and make a run for the car." "That's suicide, Matt," I protested, but his mind was made up. With hesitation, we opened the window as quietly as we could. The cold desert air rushed into the room, sending a shiver down my spine. Sarah and Rachel climbed out first, and I helped them down. Matt left the main room and began shouting, trying to draw the figure's attention. "Hey, I'm right here! Come and get me!" My heart pounded as I led Sarah and Rachel toward the car. When we got closer, we saw the windshield was shattered, but the keys were still in the ignition. I slid into the driver's seat, and the girls huddled in the back. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life, illuminating something in the headlights that made my blood run cold. 3 tall figures, dressed in tattered clothes with their faces obscured, stood just a few meters away, completely still. One of them held what looked like an axe. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas. The figures moved, but one of them threw something at the car, shattering a headlight. We tore down the dirt road, leaving the cabin, the desert, and Matt behind. When we reached the police station, we told them everything. They sent a team to investigate the cabin, but when they returned, they said they hadn't found anything. No figures, no broken glass, no signs of a struggle. To this day, we don't know what happened that night. The guilt of leaving Matt behind is something I carry with me. The cabin still haunts my nightmares, as do the shadows in the desert. I've never gone back to that place, and I never will. It's been a few nights now that I've tried to summon the courage to share what happened to me on an isolated trail in Colorado. The experience still keeps me awake, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to erase the images from my mind. I never thought something so disturbing could happen to me, but maybe sharing it will help bring some order to the chaos of that day. Last summer, my friend Brandon and I decided to explore a remote trail in Colorado known as the Forbidden Trail. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find in tourist guides, and few people even knew of its existence. Brandon discovered it on an obscure forum. "This is going to be amazing," he said. "No one goes there, so it'll just be us, nature, and silence." We set out early, driving nearly 3 hours to reach the trailhead. The trail began in an open clearing, marked by an old, weathered sign that barely read, "Restricted Area." The warning seemed more decorative than serious. The place was deserted, except for an old car parked beneath a tree. The air was cooler than I expected, even for summer. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our footsteps. The landscape was stunning, with towering trees and mountains in the distance. It was easy to see why someone would risk exploring this place. At first, the trail seemed ordinary, well marked with clear signs that others had been there before us. We hiked for about 2 hours, chatting and taking pictures. Brandon, always enthusiastic, filmed everything. "If we find something cool, I want to document it," he said. That's when the strange things began. The first sign was the sound. A faint whistling coming from somewhere in the trees. It didn't sound like birds or wind. It was rhythmic, as if someone was trying to get our attention. Brandon laughed it off, saying it was probably another hiker playing a prank. But something about the sound unsettled me. It came and went, always seeming to follow us. Then we saw the markings. Strange symbols carved into the trees, almost like runes. "This is wild," Brandon said, filming the carvings. "Looks like some kind of ritual stuff." I didn't find it funny. The farther we walked, the more symbols we saw. The trail began to change. The trees grew closer together, forming a tunnel that blocked out almost all sunlight. The silence, once peaceful, now felt oppressive. Even the sounds of the forest were gone. And then we found the campsite. It was a small clearing with 2 torn tents and a circle of stones. Clothes were scattered around as if someone had left in a hurry. Brandon seemed fascinated, but my heart was racing. Something was wrong. While Brandon searched the tents, I stayed in the clearing, scanning the area. He found an old backpack with some normal items, but also some unsettling ones. A blood-stained knife, a notebook with ripped-out pages, and a stopped watch, frozen at 3:15. "What the hell happened here?" Brandon asked, holding up the watch. Before I could answer, we heard it. Footsteps. They were light but deliberate, coming from the forest behind us. We both turned to look, but we couldn't see anything. Brandon shouted, "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. I was about to suggest we leave when we saw movement among the trees. It wasn't an animal, it was a shadow, tall and broad, moving slowly but deliberately. We couldn't make out details, only a human-like silhouette. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, but Brandon insisted on staying. "Relax, it's probably just a hunter." But when the figure stepped out of the shadows, every instinct in me screamed to run. It was far away, but we could see enough to know it wasn't normal. It was tall, with broad shoulders, and wore something like a cloak. Its face was obscured, but the eyes, they glowed. "What the hell is that?" Brandon murmured, dropping his camera. Before we could react, the whistling started again, louder and closer this time. It wasn't a normal sound. It seemed to pierce through my bones, making my entire body tremble. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Brandon's arm. Without looking back, we ran down the trail, but it felt different, as if the trees had shifted. No matter how far we ran, the whistling stayed with us, chasing us through the darkness. After what felt like hours, we burst into the clearing where we had started. The old car was still there, its doors now open and empty. We scrambled into our car and sped away, gravel flying under the tires. But as we drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. Standing in the middle of the road was the figure, motionless, watching us disappear into the distance. To this day, I still hear that whistle in my dreams. When we reached the main road, the silence inside the car was suffocating. Brandon was pale, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, and I couldn't stop glancing back, expecting that figure to reappear at any moment. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to belong to this world. I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Both of us had seen it. Both of us had heard it. The feeling of being watched lingered, even as we put miles between ourselves and the trail. The road was desolate, the trees on either side forming a tunnel of darkness that seemed to close in around us. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was almost 9 p.m., but time felt frozen. "Do you think it's following us?" Brandon finally broke the silence, his voice low and tense. "I don't know what to think," I admitted, trying to keep my composure. "But that wasn't human." Brandon gripped the wheel tighter. "You saw its eyes, didn't you? That glow. It doesn't make any sense." I tried to calm him down, but the truth was I was just as terrified. Something was deeply wrong with that place. It felt like the trail had led us to that encounter on purpose, and the thought of how close we'd come to something worse made my stomach churn. As the road stretched on, the tension in the car seemed to thicken. Then, something happened that nearly drove us off the road. Brandon slammed on the brakes when we saw something in the middle of the asphalt. It was a figure, motionless, standing dead center in the lane. "It's them!" Brandon shouted, his voice trembling with fear. I looked closer and realized it was the same silhouette we'd seen in the forest. The glowing eyes were unmistakable, like two burning coals fixed in an invisible face. We sat frozen, the car's headlights illuminating the figure. But it didn't move. It made no sound. It only stared. "Go! Let's get out of here!" I yelled, panic rising in my chest. Brandon shifted into reverse, but the figure began walking toward us, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a run, but there was a menacing intent in every step, as if it was daring us to stay. Finally, Brandon turned the car around and sped off in the opposite direction. The silence returned, but it was worse now. Neither of us wanted to say it aloud, but we knew this wasn't over. By the time we reached the city, it was late into the night. We drove straight to my house, desperate for some sense of safety. As soon as we got inside, Brandon locked every door and window while I stood in the living room, trying to process what had just happened. "Do you think it'll find us here?" Brandon asked, his breath shaky as he drew the curtains. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I don't think it's something physical, something that can be stopped by locks." That night was the longest of my life. Brandon eventually fell asleep on the couch, but I couldn't close my eyes. Every time I tried, I saw those glowing eyes and heard the whistle. It was as if the sound had been burned into my mind. Around 3 a.m., the stillness of the house was broken. A faint, almost imperceptible sound began outside. My heart stopped when I realized what it was. The whistle. I rose from the couch, my legs feeling like lead, and crept toward the window, careful not to move the curtain too much. Outside, standing on the sidewalk, was the figure. It was motionless, staring directly at my window. The glow of its eyes was even brighter under the pale moonlight. I called out to Brandon, waking him with a start. When he joined me at the window and saw what I was seeing, his face went as white as a sheet. "This isn't possible. How did it find us?" With no idea what else to do, we called the police. We couldn't just ignore it. But while we waited, the figure vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. When the officers arrived, they found nothing. And it was clear from their expressions that they didn't believe our story. The days that followed were marked by paranoia. Brandon and I barely left the house, and when we did, we avoided deserted roads and trails. The feeling of being watched never left us, even in the most mundane moments. A month later, I made a decision I still question to this day. I returned to the trail. Brandon refused to join me. So, I went alone. I needed answers. When I arrived at the clearing where we had first parked, everything seemed normal, except for one thing. Where our car had been, there was now a perfect circle etched into the dirt, surrounded by symbols like the ones we'd seen carved into the trees. I stared at it for a long moment, the air around me growing unnaturally still. Then the wind shifted and I heard it, faint and distant but unmistakable, the whistle. I turned and left without looking back. I've never returned to that trail, and I never will. But the sound of that whistle still haunts me, creeping into my dreams and reminding me that some places should remain unexplored. Hello everyone, my name is Ryan, and it's been a few weeks now that I've been gathering the courage to share this story with you. I'm not someone who easily believes in the supernatural, but what happened to me at the Texas State Fair last year still leaves me without answers. Maybe some of you can help me understand. It was October last year, and like every year, the Texas State Fair was in full swing. I love that place. The food, the rides, the nostalgia of the Ferris wheel have always drawn me in. I took the afternoon off work to enjoy the event, something I've done since I was a kid. The fair was packed as usual. The sound of laughter, screams from the rides, and blaring music created a hypnotic atmosphere. As I wandered through rows of cotton candy stalls and game booths, I lost track of time. I'd promised myself not to spend too much money, but as always, I was already lugging around bags full of useless prizes. Around 7 p.m., I started to notice something strange. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the atmosphere had become denser, more stifling, despite being outside. That's when I saw a child. He looked about 6 or 7 years old, a blond boy in a light blue shirt and worn-out jeans. He was standing near a shooting gallery booth, staring intently at something in the distance. What caught my attention was that he was completely alone, unusual in such a crowded place. Kids are usually with their parents or friends. Concerned, I approached him. "Hey kid, are you lost?" I asked. He slowly turned his head toward me, and for a moment I was taken aback. His eyes were strange. I can't quite explain it, but there was something about them that made me uneasy. He responded in a low, monotone voice, "I'm waiting for my mom." I looked around, expecting to see someone searching for a lost child, but no one seemed to notice. The fair continued as if nothing was wrong. "Where did you see your mom last?" I asked. The boy pointed toward a row of booths farther ahead, an area that looked less crowded and poorly lit. "She went that way," he said. Something felt off. Maybe it was just my imagination, but that kid gave me chills. Still, I decided to help him. "All right, let's go take a look, but stay close to me, okay?" He nodded and started walking beside me in silence. As we moved, I noticed he made no effort to hold my hand or even look at me. He seemed disconnected. We reached the row of booths he had pointed to, and it was emptier than I expected. The lights from the booths flickered intermittently, casting unsettling shadows. Some booths were closed, and the distant sounds of the fair felt muffled here. "Are you sure she went this way?" I asked. The boy nodded again and began walking faster, almost running, as if he knew exactly where he was going. I tried to keep up, but he turned a corner and vanished. When I rounded the corner, there was no sign of him. "Kid," I called out, but there was no answer. I looked around, panic starting to set in. How could he have disappeared so quickly? Then I heard a faint sound, childlike laughter, coming from an abandoned booth. I walked slowly toward the booth, sweat trickling down my back. The laughter grew louder, but it was distorted, like it was playing from an old cassette tape. When I reached the entrance and looked inside, my heart nearly stopped. Inside the booth there was no one, but old toys lay scattered across the dusty floor. In the center stood a large mirror with a worn gold frame. In the reflection I saw the boy, staring at me with those strange eyes. But when I turned around, no one was there. That's when panic overtook me. I pulled out my phone, intending to snap a picture or call for help. But before I could do anything, the booth's lights flickered and went out. The laughter ceased, and an absolute silence fell. I ran, my heart pounding, not daring to look back. In that moment, all I cared about was getting away from that place. Something about that booth, about that child, was not normal. When I finally made it back to the main area of the fair, everything seemed exactly as it was before, as if nothing had happened. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Whatever it wasn't over. If anyone has experienced anything similar at the Texas State Fair or anywhere else, please share your stories. I need to know I'm not alone in this, and maybe together we can find some answers. After that experience at the booth, the normalcy of the fair felt almost surreal. Everything around me was still vibrant and noisy, but inside, the unease only grew stronger. My heart was still racing as I walked toward the exit. All I wanted was to leave, to forget what I had seen. But something inside me wouldn't let me move on. Is the child still in danger? That question haunted me. Whatever had happened in that booth, there was still a chance the boy was lost, or worse, in peril. Against every instinct screaming at me to let it go, I decided to return to the area where he had disappeared. As I made my way back, I noticed that part of the fair felt even more desolate than before. Booths that had been lit earlier were now completely dark, as if no one had used them in years. The cheerful noise of the crowd faded with every step, replaced by an eerie silence that crept into my bones. When I reached the booth, where I'd last seen the mirror and the boy, it was completely empty. No toys, no mirror, just an abandoned shell, as if it had been untouched for decades. My stomach sank, and a part of me started to doubt my own sanity. Had I imagined the whole thing? As I stood there trying to piece together what was happening, I heard that distorted laughter again, this time from somewhere behind me. I spun around quickly, but no one was there. Just the empty corridor and the faint flicker of lights in the distance. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. But inside, I was terrified. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint whisper like wind rustling through leaves. But we were in a fairground, surrounded by asphalt and booths. There were no trees, no wind. Then something on the ground caught my eye. Small footprints, shimmering as though made of glitter, reflected the dim, flickering lights of the booths. The footprints trailed toward another stall farther down, partially obscured by old, tattered tarps. I followed the footprints, every nerve in my body screaming for me to stop. With each step, the air grew heavier, as if some unseen force was pressing down on me, willing me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know. When I reached the entrance of the booth, I saw something I will never forget. In the center was another mirror, larger and more ornate than the first. Its black frame seemed to pulse faintly, almost as if it were alive. In the reflection, I saw the boy standing there, staring at me with those unnerving eyes. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a tall, gaunt figure, cloaked in shadows. Its glowing eyes burned into mine, radiating a malevolent energy that made my skin crawl. "Help me," the boy said, his voice distant, as if echoing from another world. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. "Who are you? What's happening here?" I asked, my voice trembling. But there was no response. The shadowy figure began to move, slowly at first, as though advancing toward the boy in the reflection. But then I realized it wasn't just a reflection. The shadow was extending beyond the mirror, reaching into my world. That's when I ran. I bolted from the booth, my legs moving on instinct. I didn't dare look back, even as I heard the distorted laughter and faint whispers chasing me. I only stopped running when I reached the main part of the fair, where the familiar sounds of the crowd wrapped around me like a protective shield. As I caught my breath and looked around, I realized no one else seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary. The ride spun, the music blared, and people laughed as though the eerie part of the fair didn't exist. It was as if only I had been able to see it. I left the fair immediately and drove straight home, my hands shaking on the wheel. For days afterward, I searched online, desperate to find out if anyone else had experienced something similar. That's when I stumbled across an old story about a child who had mysteriously vanished at the Texas State Fair many years ago. Witnesses claimed the boy was last seen near a mirror booth that disappeared without a trace shortly after the incident. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night. But one thing is certain, that fair hides something that doesn't belong to our world. If you ever visit the Texas State Fair, be cautious of empty booths and mirrors. You never know what might be waiting on the other side. Hello everyone on the channel. My name is Thomas, and it took me days to gather the courage to write this story. What I'm about to share happened 2 years ago when I visited Cape Cod, Massachusetts. I'm a freelance photographer specializing in isolated locations with unique histories, always seeking out unusual spots for my projects. But my experience in Cape Cod was unlike anything I've ever encountered. Even now, I remember it with a mix of fascination and fear. At the time, I had received a tip about the old Cape Cod lighthouse, a structure abandoned decades ago and said to carry an aura of mystery. Locals claimed the lighthouse still emitted light at night despite being non-operational, and that strange voices could be heard around it. I was skeptical, but I'll admit the stories intrigued me. With my camera packed and a rough map in hand, I rented a Jeep and set out to find the place. The journey wasn't easy. The roads leading to the lighthouse were barely there, mostly sand surrounded by dunes that all looked the same. The cold Atlantic wind howled through the vehicle's windows, adding to the sense of isolation. After nearly an hour of driving, I reached a makeshift parking area where a faded wooden sign read, Restricted area. Danger. That should have been my cue to turn back, but curiosity outweighed caution. I grabbed my gear and began the trek to the lighthouse. The path was long and lonely. The closer I got, the louder the sound of the waves became. They crashed against the rocks with a force that felt almost like a warning, as if the sea itself was telling me to stay away. When I finally saw the lighthouse, my breath caught. It was larger than I'd imagined, its white exterior weathered and rusted at the top. The sky was beginning to darken, and the wind felt even colder. It was the perfect setting for photos, but something about the scene felt off. As I set up my tripod, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the sand leading away from the lighthouse. They were fresh, as if someone had just been there. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. I told myself it was probably a fisherman or another curious visitor, but a knot of unease formed in my stomach. I focused on taking photos, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. As the sun set, the lighthouse took on a more menacing appearance. Shadows cast by the surrounding rocks seemed to shift unnaturally, and the crashing waves began to mingle with something else. It was faint, but I could hear a distant whisper, carried by the wind, forming words I couldn't understand. I decided to venture inside the lighthouse, hoping to capture some unique angles. The wooden door was slightly ajar, creaking with each gust of wind. I stepped inside cautiously, shining my flashlight around. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and salt, and the floor was littered with sand and fragments of rotting wood. As I explored, a sound froze me in place. Footsteps, echoing faintly, coming from above. I held my breath, straining to hear, but now there was only the sound of my own heartbeat. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. The spiral staircase groaned under my weight, each step amplifying my sense of dread. The further I climbed, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. When I reached the top, I found the small room that once housed the lighthouse's lamp. It was empty, except for one thing. In the center of the floor was a small mirror with an ornate, weathered wooden frame, as though it had been deliberately placed there. As I stepped closer, something about the reflection caught my eye. It didn't seem right. The room behind me appeared darker in the mirror, and I saw movement, a shadow shifting. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My pulse quickened. I knew it was time to leave. I descended the stairs as fast as I could, trying to ignore the sounds that seemed to echo behind me. By the time I stepped outside, the wind had picked up, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold: the footprints in the sand. They were now circling the lighthouse as though someone, or something, had been pacing around while I was inside. The wind howled fiercely, almost pushing me away from the structure. I hurried back to the Jeep, feeling like I had narrowly escaped something I couldn't explain. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. A light at the top of the lighthouse, blinking slowly, deliberately. There was no one there to turn it on. Yet it shone, as if watching me retreat into the night. Even now, I can't fully comprehend what I experienced that day. But I know this. Cape Cod's old lighthouse isn't just a relic of the past. It's a gateway to something beyond our understanding. If you ever decide to visit, tread carefully. Some places were meant to be left alone. I spent the following days trying to forget what happened at the Cape Cod lighthouse, but the images and sounds of that night continued to haunt me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers in the wind and see that inexplicable light blinking at the top of the lighthouse. Hoping to make sense of what I had experienced, I decided to review the photos I had taken that night. When I connected my camera to the computer, my heart began to race. The first photos, taken outside, looked normal. The lighthouse against the dark sky, the rough ocean waves in the background. But as I scrolled through the pictures taken inside the lighthouse, something unsettling began to emerge. In some photos, strange shadows appeared in the background, where I was certain nothing had been. In others, inexplicable reflections glimmered in the broken glass or the worn walls. And in the final photo taken at the top of the lighthouse, the antique mirror unmistakably reflected something. A figure, blurred but unmistakably human, staring directly at me, A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that what I had felt that night was not paranoia. Something, or someone, had been there with me. This revelation left me torn. Part of me wanted to forget the entire ordeal and move on, but another part was obsessed with uncovering the truth. I knew returning to the lighthouse was dangerous, but I felt compelled to confront my fears and understand what was happening. The next evening, I prepared myself. Armed with a stronger flashlight and my phone, I headed to the local Cape Cod library. I spent hours poring over books and records about the lighthouse, trying to piece together its history and the rumors surrounding it. I discovered it had been decommissioned over 40 years ago after a series of mysterious disappearances involving fishermen and tourists in the area. Locals believed the lighthouse was cursed and avoided it entirely. One of the oldest accounts mentioned a lighthouse keeper who had gone mad, murdering his family before vanishing without a trace. My curiosity had turned into determination. I climbed into my Jeep and drove back to the lighthouse, this time resolute in my quest for answers. The night was darker, the wind stronger, but I refused to turn back. When I arrived, the lighthouse looked even more foreboding than before, as if it had been waiting for me. The light at the top was blinking again, erratically, like a signal. Inside, everything was as I remembered. The damp, musty smell, the sand-covered floor, the muted howling of the wind. I began climbing the stairs, but this time the steps seemed frailer, groaning under my weight as though they might collapse at any moment. When I reached the top, the mirror was still there, exactly where it had been. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of its old wooden frame in my hands. As I gazed into it, I saw my reflection, but behind me, something moved again. I spun around, but the room was empty. Then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible laugh echoing through the walls. My flashlight flickered and panic surged through me. I bolted down the stairs, but when I reached the ground floor, the door I had entered through was shut tight. I pulled on it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps descending the stairs sent a wave of cold terror through my body. Whatever it was coming toward me. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the footsteps grew louder and closer. Finally, the door gave way, and I tumbled out onto the sand. Gasping for air, I turned to look back and saw the silhouette of a man at the top of the lighthouse. He was standing motionless, watching me. His figure was starkly outlined against the light, which now shone blindingly bright. I scrambled to my Jeep, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a more populated area where I could finally catch my breath. Since that night, I've never returned to Cape Cod, but the memories of that lighthouse have never left me. I still don't know what I encountered there. Perhaps it was a spirit, a memory trapped in time, or something far worse. All I know is that the lighthouse holds secrets that should remain buried, and sometimes it's better to let the past stay in the shadows. I was so happy that day. For months I had been planning a trip to escape my routine, and the moment had finally arrived. I chose a route that passed through the heart of West Virginia, a region filled with breathtaking landscapes and intriguing stories. My goal was to drive across the state, stopping in small towns and historic sites along the way. Little did I know that my trip would take a turn that would change my life forever. After a peaceful day driving through roads lined with mountains and forests, I decided to take a break in Point Pleasant. The town is famous for its tales of the Mothman, a legendary figure that reportedly haunted the region decades ago. I always found these stories fascinating, but I never imagined I'd experience anything close to them. The sun was setting as I stopped at a small cafe for something to eat. The waitress, an elderly woman with a warm smile, suggested I avoid driving over the Silver Hollow Bridge after dark. "The road there is treacherous at night," she said. I found it curious, but didn't give it much thought. After all, I had driven plenty of winding roads before. I finished my meal and got back into the car, determined to keep moving. The GPS indicated that Silver Hollow Bridge was the fastest route to my next destination. As the sky darkened and my headlights illuminated the narrow road, I felt a slight unease. It wasn't fear exactly, but a sense that something was out of place. I reached the bridge a little after 9 p.m. The place seemed isolated, with no other cars in sight. The tall trees along the riverbanks cast unsettling shadows, dancing in the light of my headlights. The bridge itself was old, with a rusty metal structure and cables that swayed lightly in the wind. With each step forward, my sense of unease grew stronger. Then, I noticed something strange. In the middle of the bridge, a figure appeared to be standing still. I squinted to get a better look, but the darkness made it difficult. I slowed the car, and as I approached, I realized it was a person, or at least it looked like one. They wore old-fashioned clothes, like something from another era, and stood completely motionless, staring into the distance. I hesitated, stopping the car just a few meters away. I tried honking to get their attention, but they didn't react. Curiosity and fear battled inside me. I decided to roll down the window and ask if they were okay, but before I could say anything, the figure turned slowly toward me. Their face was shrouded in shadow, but their eyes, or what I thought were eyes, glowed with an unusual intensity. It wasn't the reflection of my headlights. It was something beyond that, something that seemed to come from within them. A chill ran down my spine, and my instinct screamed at me to leave immediately. Before I could react, the car lights flickered and the engine stalled. The silence that followed was deafening. I was trapped in the middle of the bridge, with this mysterious figure slowly approaching. With every step they took, the metallic sound of their boots against the bridge echoed like thunder in my head. Terrified, I tried starting the car again, but the engine only sputtered. I glanced at the figure, now just a few meters from my car. Their glowing eyes were locked onto me, and something about their presence was suffocating, as if all the air around me had vanished. Desperate, I opened the car door and stepped out, shouting for them to stop. But as soon as my feet touched the bridge, the figure froze. A cold wind swept through the area, and I swear I heard a voice whisper my name. There was no one there but me and that thing. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but before I could think of anything, the figure raised an arm, pointing toward the water below the bridge. Instinctively, I looked in that direction, and what I saw was even more horrifying. Something was moving on the surface of the dark river, as though several shadows were rising to the surface. I couldn't take my eyes off the water below the bridge. The shadows moved hypnotically, as if drawn by some invisible force. The wind howled around me, carrying with it a chill that seemed to pierce my very bones. The figure in front of me remained motionless, its arm still extended toward the river. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. Finally, I mustered the courage to shout, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" My voice echoed across the bridge, but there was no answer. Instead, the figure tilted its head slightly, as if analyzing my question, or perhaps mocking my weakness. Suddenly, a deafening sound tore through the air, a scream that sounded human, but wasn't. It came from beneath the bridge. The noise made me step back, almost tripping over myself. Whatever was in the river now seemed to be rising, taking shape. The reflection of the shadows on the water stretched upward, as if some monstrous presence was emerging. I rushed back to the car, my hands trembling as I desperately tried to open the door. But when I glanced again at the figure, it was no longer there. It was as if it had disintegrated into the air. I looked around trying to find it, but it had vanished. That only made me more terrified. It was as though it had never been there, yet the fear coursing through me told me otherwise. The car's engine was still dead, and the darkness around me seemed to grow denser with every passing second. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. Taking one last look at the river, I saw something that made me question my sanity. Where the shadows had been dancing, there was now a faint, pulsating light, just bright enough to partially illuminate the water. Within that light, there appeared to be faces, human faces, twisted in expressions of agony. Overcome with fear, I started running in the opposite direction, back toward the start of the bridge. I no longer cared about the car, my belongings, or anything else. I just needed to get out of there. As I ran, I could hear footsteps behind me, but when I looked back, no one was there. It was as if the sound was inside my head, hammering away at my thoughts and amplifying my desperation. Finally, I reached the end of the bridge and collapsed onto the ground, trying to catch my breath. I looked back one last time and saw the car standing alone in the middle of the bridge. But now, surrounding it, there were dozens of figures, all standing still and staring in my direction. Their eyes glowed, exactly like the eyes of the figure I had seen earlier. The sound of an engine snapped me back to reality. A pickup truck was coming down the road toward me. I got up and waved desperately for the driver to stop. The vehicle slowed, and an older man rolled down the window looking at me with concern. "Are you okay, son?" he asked. I couldn't form words, I just pointed toward the bridge. He looked in the direction I indicated and frowned. "What's there? I don't see anything." My heart sank. How could he not see it? I turned to look again, but this time the bridge was empty. The car, the figures, everything had vanished. Not knowing what else to say, I simply asked for a ride back to town. During the ride, the man told me that the Silver Hollow Bridge was notorious for strange occurrences, especially at night. Some folks say it's haunted by those who died when the bridge collapsed back in the 50s. Others say it's something worse, something that doesn't belong to this world, he said, shaking his head. When we finally arrived in town, I thanked the man and went straight to a motel. I stayed up all night trying to process what had happened. The next day, I went back to the bridge during daylight, hoping to retrieve my car. It was still there, exactly where I had left it, but something was different. On the rear window there were handprints, dozens of them, small and large, as if something had tried to force its way inside. I got in the car and drove away as fast as I could. Since then, I've avoided that area altogether. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was spirits, or maybe it was something beyond what our minds can comprehend. All I know is that the bridge holds secrets that are better left undiscovered.